History is often written in bold headlines, parades of victory, and carefully selected photographs. Yet beneath the triumphal accounts of World War II lies another record. One intentionally obscured, classified, and buried in archives for decades. These are the stories that were never intended for public eyes, reports marked top secret, and locked away in steel cabinets across Washington, London, and Moscow. The paper trails were deliberately fragmented, pages removed, names redacted, and in many cases, entire files incinerated. But fragments survived. Letters between generals, memoranda between ministers, intercepted cables decrypted in dimly lit basements, all whisper of a reality far darker than the official version. These disturbing secrets, unearthed long after the war's end, expose the betrayals, compromises, and forbidden bargains that shaped the balance of the 20th century. What you are about to hear are not stories of battlefield heroics or national pride, but revelations from long-forgotten archives. Prepare to question not just what was won, but at what cost it was truly achieved. As you listen, ask yourself, if these files remained hidden for so long, what else still waits, sealed and silent, in the vaults of power? Chapter 1: The Forbidden Experiments of Unit 731. In the frozen expanse of northeastern China, hidden from the world's gaze, a fortress of horror was constructed in 1936. Officially, it was the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. In reality, it was Unit 731, Japan's most secretive and sadistic biological warfare program. Located near Harbin, within the puppet state of Manchukuo, the facility sprawled across 6 square kilometers, encircled by high fences, guard towers, and patrol dogs. Its outward appearance suggested a military research station. Inside, however, it became a laboratory of human suffering, unmatched in cruelty and scale. Prisoners, known as maruta or logs, were transported in sealed trucks, their identities erased upon arrival. They were Chinese peasants, Soviet soldiers, Korean rebels, and even captured Western prisoners of war. To the Japanese doctors and officers who worked there, they were not human beings, but expendable test subjects. Over the course of the war, thousands entered through the gates of Unit 731. Few, if any, left alive. Officially, nothing existed. No lists of names, no public record. Just silence, reinforced by threats and carefully orchestrated denials. The experiments performed within those walls defy comprehension. Victims were deliberately infected with plague, cholera, anthrax, and typhus. To monitor the progress of disease, researchers dissected them alive without anesthesia, recording in meticulous detail how pathogens destroyed human organs. Frostbite studies involved plunging prisoners' limbs into icy water until the flesh froze solid. Limbs were then beaten with sticks or subjected to rapid thawing to determine the most effective methods of battlefield treatment or amputation. Some subjects were tied to wooden posts, while bombs filled with shrapnel, chemical agents, or biological toxins were detonated nearby. The results were documented with the cold precision of men who no longer saw humanity in their victims. Unit 731 was commanded by Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a brilliant but ruthless physician who rose to power within the Imperial Japanese Army. Ishii was obsessed with the potential of biological weapons to tip the balance of war. He believed diseases could do what conventional weapons could not: cripple entire cities, armies, and nations. His experiments, though barbaric, were driven by this singular ambition. Thousands suffered in agony for the sake of data that Ishii guarded with an almost religious fervor. Japanese officers under his command often treated the atrocities as routine procedure, a necessary evil in service of empire. As the tide of war turned in 1944 and 1945, evidence of Unit 731's crimes threatened to come to light. Soviet advances in Manchuria closed in on Harbin. Orders were issued to destroy the facility, eliminate records, and execute remaining prisoners. In August 1945, as the Soviet Union launched Operation August Storm, Ishii and his men abandoned Unit 731, blowing up buildings and murdering captives in an attempt to erase all traces of their work. But fragments remained, documents buried, photographs smuggled, and whispers carried by survivors. What happened next reveals the disturbing moral compromises of the victorious Allies. In 1946, as Tokyo prepared for the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, US intelligence officers became aware of Unit 731's research. Reports filtered in from captured Japanese officers, Soviet interrogations, and intercepted communications. The experiments were undeniable. Yet instead of pursuing justice, American intelligence made a calculated decision. They offered Ishii and his senior staff immunity from war crimes prosecution in exchange for exclusive access to their research. The deal was struck in secrecy, sanctioned by General Douglas MacArthur and officials in Washington who believed the data could prove vital in future conflicts, particularly against the Soviet Union. Thus, men who had overseen mass murder through science walked free. Ishii himself lived until 1959, never once brought to trial. Many of his subordinates went on to hold prestigious positions in post-war Japan: professors, researchers, corporate executives. Their knowledge, extracted through suffering, was woven into the emerging architecture of Cold War biological warfare programs in the United States. Documents later declassified in the 1980s and 1990s revealed memoranda between US Army intelligence and Ishii, confirming the immunity agreement and cataloging the research findings handed over. The Soviet Union, furious at being excluded from this arrangement, staged its own trials in Khabarovsk in 1949. 12 former members of Unit 731 were prosecuted, and testimonies detailed the grotesque experiments in chilling detail. Western governments dismissed these proceedings at the time as communist propaganda. Only decades later, when Japanese historians and survivors groups forced the release of corroborating evidence, did the world begin to acknowledge that the Soviets had been telling the truth. The legacy of Unit 731 remains an open wound. In China, mass graves near Harbin continue to yield bones, evidence of the thousands who perished. Survivors and their families have sought recognition and justice, but official apologies remain scarce. Japan has struggled with the memory, often minimizing or denying the full scope of atrocities. Meanwhile, the shadow of Unit 731 stretches far beyond Asia. The United States, having buried the crimes in exchange for data, carries a stain of complicity. The documents that escaped destruction show clearly. The atrocities were known, the decision to suppress them deliberate, and the pursuit of scientific advantage chosen over human justice. When reading these files today, one cannot escape the sense of a calculated betrayal. For the victims who became logs, there were no graves marked, no names preserved, no voices heard in court. They existed only as data points on a chart, entries in a laboratory notebook, erased by both their tormentors and those who later profited from their suffering. To call it a war crime scarcely captures the enormity of what occurred. It was the systematic dehumanization of thousands, hidden behind the sterile language of science and shielded by the politics of the Cold War. Unit 731 was more than a secret program. It was a mirror held up to humanity's darkest capacity, to transform knowledge into cruelty, and to bury truth when it proves inconvenient. The files that remain declassified are not just records of past crimes, but warnings, reminders of what happens when science is severed from morality, and when governments decide that justice is expendable in the name of power. In the silence of those missing archives, one question lingers. How many other truths remain locked away, waiting for the right moment to surface? Chapter 2: Operation Paperclip's Disturbing Hidden Files. When the guns of World War II fell silent in May 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Cities reduced to rubble, millions displaced, the old order shattered. Yet beneath the ashes of the Reich, something else remained: knowledge. The Nazi war machine had invested heavily in advanced technology: jet propulsion, guided missiles, chemical agents, and rocket systems that defied Allied expectations. These innovations, born in secrecy and fueled by cruelty, became the object of a new kind of war. The United States and the Soviet Union both understood that whoever controlled the minds behind these inventions would control the future. Thus began Operation Paperclip, a program so disturbing in its implications that its true nature remained classified for decades. The mission was simple in principle, but ethically devastating. Under Paperclip, American intelligence sought to recruit Nazi scientists, engineers, and technicians, smuggling them into the United States to work on defense and space projects. More than 1,600 individuals would eventually be absorbed. Their pasts were scrubbed, sanitized, and rewritten. The black ink of war crimes was erased with carefully forged documents. Men who once wore the black uniform of the SS were recast as patriotic assets to America's Cold War arsenal. What the public saw was only the dazzling outcome: rockets piercing the stratosphere, satellites orbiting Earth, astronauts preparing for journeys to the moon. What they did not see were the origins, the concentration camps, the forced labor, the emaciated corpses that paved the way to those triumphs. One of the most prominent figures absorbed by Paperclip was Wernher von Braun, the brilliant but compromised engineer behind the V2 rocket program. During the war, von Braun and his team at Peenemünde developed the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. These V2 rockets rained down upon London, Antwerp, and Paris, killing thousands of civilians. The rockets were assembled in the Mittelwerk facility, constructed within the tunnels of the Harz Mountains. Prisoners from the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp labored under inhuman conditions to build them. Starvation, disease, and execution claimed the lives of more than 20,000 laborers, more than the rockets themselves killed. Von Braun was not blind to this reality. He visited the Mittelwerk tunnels, aware of the suffering. Yet in the post-war narrative crafted for him by American intelligence, those details vanished. He became the father of the Saturn V rocket, a pioneer of NASA, his past blurred into a haze of denials and omissions. The decision to protect men like von Braun was not taken lightly, but it was deliberate. The US Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, working under the Office of Strategic Services and later the CIA, compiled lists of scientists deemed essential. Many were flagged as ardent Nazis or implicated in war crimes. Normally, these names would disqualify them, yet directives were quietly issued. The disqualifying information was to be removed from dossiers. Paperclips were literally attached to the files of chosen individuals, indicating their protected status. Trials at Nuremberg prosecuted the visible faces of the Reich, while others simply disappeared into the fabric of American science. To the outside world, they had been absorbed into the shadows. The Soviet Union, not to be outdone, launched its own counterpart, Operation Osoaviakhim. In October 1946, Soviet forces swept across occupied Germany, forcibly relocating more than 2,000 German specialists, along with their families, to the Soviet Union. Many were taken against their will, their expertise applied to Soviet missile programs in Siberia and Moscow. The Cold War became not only a battle of ideologies, but a competition of captured minds, a silent war fought through laboratories and test ranges rather than tanks and infantry. Both sides buried their ethics under the weight of strategic necessity. The disturbing element of Operation Paperclip lies not merely in the recruitment, but in the deliberate deception. In 1947, the US Department of State drafted a memorandum warning that the admission of such individuals violated immigration laws and would spark public outrage. The response was not reconsideration, but concealment. Files were rewritten, biographies were fabricated. Men who had signed papers for slave labor allocations or approved the testing of weapons on civilian populations were described as apolitical engineers, swept along by the current of war. The public, reeling from revelations at Nuremberg, was never told the full truth. To admit it would have been to stain America's moral high ground in the emerging Cold War. Beyond von Braun, other names lurk in the Paperclip archives. Hubertus Strughold, known as the father of space medicine, conducted hypothermia experiments on prisoners at Dachau, exposing them to freezing water to study survival. Yet, in the United States, he became a pioneer of aerospace medicine, honored by NASA until his past resurfaced decades later. Walter Schreiber, a Wehrmacht general implicated in biological warfare, was quietly relocated to Argentina after his background threatened exposure. Kurt Blome, once Deputy Surgeon General of the Reich and overseer of chemical experiments, was acquitted at Nuremberg despite overwhelming evidence, his expertise in plague research too valuable to discard. The list extends, each name carrying shadows too deep to reconcile with their later accolades. For decades, the true nature of Operation Paperclip remained buried. Official denials persisted, and many of the files remained sealed until the 1980s and 1990s, when investigative journalists and historians began prying open the archives. What emerged was damning. Memoranda with blacked-out names, cables marked "Eyes Only," and testimonies of survivors all pointed to the same reality. The United States had knowingly harbored war criminals in pursuit of scientific superiority. The moral compromises were profound and the consequences long-lasting. By elevating these men, their narratives were rewritten, their crimes diluted in the glow of technological progress. A generation grew up celebrating the moon landings, unaware that the rockets carrying astronauts heavenward were born in the underground tunnels of Dora, where the screams of dying laborers once echoed. The disturbing legacy of Paperclip does not end with history. It challenges us to confront the uncomfortable reality that nations will often sacrifice morality for power. Justice, so forcefully promised at Nuremberg, was unevenly applied. Some perpetrators were hanged for their crimes, while others dined at American banquets and walked the halls of universities. The declassified files reveal a pattern not of ignorance but of deliberate suppression. The ethical stain cannot be erased, for it lives in the very foundations of the Cold War technological race. The next time one gazes at the photographs of astronauts on the lunar surface, or marvels at the rockets piercing the skies, one must also remember the tunnels of Mittelwerk, the graves of slave laborers, and the files marked with paperclips. The story of Operation Paperclip is not just about science. It is about how history itself can be rewritten when power demands it, and how disturbing truths can remain classified for decades, waiting for the moment when the world is finally ready to confront them. Chapter 3: Churchill's erased blacklist of collaborators. The mythology of Britain's wartime defiance is deeply etched into collective memory. Images of Winston Churchill, cigar in hand, proclaiming that Britain would never surrender, stand as symbols of national unity against the Nazi menace. Yet hidden within the archives of Whitehall and the vaults of MI5 is a far more complex, troubling record, one that suggests betrayal lurked within the highest levels of European society. During the darkest years of the war, as invasion loomed and German influence spread across the continent, British intelligence assembled a secret document, a blacklist of collaborators. This list did not contain minor functionaries or fringe sympathizers. It named powerful figures, politicians, aristocrats, industrial magnates, and even members of royal households whose dealings with the Reich threatened to undermine the Allied cause. It was a record never meant to be made public, its very existence denied for decades. But fragments that have emerged paint a picture of complicity that shakes the foundations of post-war narratives. The origins of the blacklist can be traced to 1940, after the fall of France. Britain, isolated and vulnerable, feared infiltration, not only from German spies, but also from within its own ruling classes. MI5, working alongside the Special Operations Executive, compiled intelligence on individuals across Europe who had maintained connections with the Nazi regime. Some were businessmen trading with Germany despite blockades. Others were political figures who believed in accommodation with Hitler. In the event of Operation Sea Lion, the planned German invasion of Britain, these names were to be targeted for immediate arrest or elimination. Churchill himself, fully aware of the gravity of the threat, approved measures that bordered on extrajudicial action. Survival of the state demanded ruthless preparation, even if it meant preemptively silencing influential collaborators. The names that surfaced in early drafts of the list were explosive. Rumors persisted of aristocrats sympathetic to fascism, of members of parliament who admired Hitler's order and feared Bolshevism more than Nazism. Across occupied Europe, industrialists in Belgium, France, and the Netherlands were accused of continuing business with the Reich, supplying materials vital to the German war effort. In Norway, prominent families maintained contact with Quisling's puppet regime. Even within Britain itself, whispers spread of a so-called fifth column, supported by figures in high society. The list captured these suspicions, codified into files marked Most Secret, and stored under lock and key in London's secure archives. What makes the blacklist particularly disturbing is not just who appeared on it, but what became of them after the war. Many survived unscathed, their wartime connections quietly erased. Some even rose to prominent positions in post-war governments, European reconstruction efforts, or royal courts. Documents suggest deliberate suppression, files destroyed, references redacted, inconvenient testimonies silenced. For Churchill and his successors, revealing the extent of elite collaboration would have risked destabilizing fragile political systems in the aftermath of victory. Exposing influential names could have shattered public trust in the very institutions tasked with rebuilding Europe. Declassified fragments reveal startling details. One MI5 memorandum dated late 1940 refers to domestic figures of considerable influence whose loyalties remain suspect. Another, from 1944, warns of industrial magnates in liberated territories whose war profiteering with the Reich must not come to light. Cross-references to the archives of the Special Operations Executive show overlapping intelligence reports, some marked for immediate destruction after 1945. It is clear that a deliberate effort was made not just to suppress individual names, but to obliterate the record itself. Yet scattered documents survived, preserved by archivists who either ignored destruction orders or misfiled the material. Among the most controversial inclusions were whispers about the Duke of Windsor, formerly King Edward VIII, who had abdicated in 1936. His ties to Nazi officials, including a meeting with Hitler in 1937, had long raised suspicion. Declassified communications confirm British and American intelligence tracked his movements closely during the war, fearing he might be used as a puppet monarch should Germany conquer Britain. While the full extent of his involvement remains debated, the very fact that he appeared in these records underscores the scale of elite compromise the Blacklist sought to conceal. The ethical dilemma faced by Churchill and his government was profound. On one hand, the Allies fought to expose and punish collaboration across occupied Europe. Vichy officials in France, Quisling in Norway, and countless others were tried or executed for treason. On the other hand, influential collaborators in Britain and its allied nations were quietly protected, their reputations preserved to maintain post-war stability. Justice was selective, dictated not only by guilt but by political necessity. The files that survive reveal the cold calculus of statecraft. Some truths were simply too dangerous to reveal, too destabilizing to confront openly. For decades, the very existence of the Blacklist was denied. Researchers requesting access to wartime archives were told no such files existed. Survivors who remembered whispers of secret arrests or veiled threats were dismissed. It was only with the gradual declassification of MI5 and SOE records in the late 20th century that fragments began to surface. Journalists uncovered references to Category A suspects slated for detention in case of invasion. Historians pieced together patterns of business ties between Allied elites and German companies. Each revelation added another layer to the unsettling picture, that the war was not simply fought between good and evil, but within shadows where loyalties blurred and survival dictated compromise. Today, the Blacklist remains incomplete. Many of the names are still redacted, hidden behind black ink or withheld under national security provisions. Yet the existence of these fragments alone forces a reckoning. The myth of total unity, of an unbreakable line between Allies and Axis, is exposed as fragile. The reality is messier, darker, and far more human. Ambition, fear, and greed drove some to compromise, even as others sacrificed everything in resistance. Churchill's erased Blacklist, buried in the classified vaults of history, reminds us that the narrative of defiance was carefully curated, not absolute. The disturbing truth is that betrayal often wore familiar faces, and the decision to erase those names was itself a collaboration, one between victors and history itself. Chapter 4: Soviet prisoner camps the Allies ignored. When the Red Army marched triumphantly across Eastern Europe, liberating Nazi concentration camps and capturing cities long oppressed by the Reich, the world celebrated the Soviet Union as a brutal yet necessary ally. Photographs of Soviet soldiers cutting the barbed wire at Auschwitz or distributing bread to emaciated survivors became iconic images of liberation. Yet behind those images lay another darker truth. While the Soviets liberated camps in the West, they were simultaneously operating a massive system of forced labor camps of their own, the Gulag. Within this vast network, prisoners of war, dissidents, and even returning Soviet soldiers found themselves condemned to years of hunger, cold, and slow death. Allied leaders knew of these camps. Intelligence reports crossed desks in London and Washington, but the political calculus of maintaining Stalin's cooperation silenced them. In exchange for unity against Hitler, the suffering of millions was ignored, redacted, or dismissed as hostile propaganda. The Soviet system of camps was not a wartime invention. It dated back to the 1930s, when Stalin's Great Terror filled Siberia with political prisoners. By 1941, when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the Gulag already held more than 2 million inmates. With the outbreak of war, its population shifted and expanded. Captured German soldiers, Romanian allies of the Reich, Hungarian conscripts, and later even Polish Home Army fighters who resisted both Nazis and Soviets were herded into cattle cars and sent east. When the Red Army overran Eastern Prussia and the Balkans in 1944 and 1945, entire populations were swept into the system. Estimates suggest more than 2 million German prisoners alone were deported to the Soviet Union after the war. Few would ever return. Life inside these camps mirrored in chilling ways the horrors of Nazi facilities. Prisoners were forced into exhausting labor, mining coal, chopping timber, building railroads across permafrost. Temperatures in Siberia plummeted to -40 degrees, with rations so meager that starvation was a constant companion. Disease spread unchecked, and guards enforced discipline with arbitrary violence. Survivors' testimonies describe days spent hauling logs until hands froze and split. Nights spent in unheated barracks where the weak were stripped of blankets by the strong. Mortality rates soared, particularly in the immediate post-war years, when Soviet authorities viewed German POWs as reparations in human form, laborers to rebuild cities and factories destroyed by war. The Allies were not ignorant of these conditions. British diplomats received Red Cross cables in 1944, warning of Soviet mistreatment of Polish prisoners, including those captured after the Warsaw Uprising. American intelligence decrypted communications suggesting mass deportations from Eastern Europe. Reports circulated through OSS and MI5 channels, detailing overcrowded camps in Kazakhstan and Siberia. Yet the official line, repeated in press conferences and parliamentary statements, spoke only of repatriation and reconstruction. To raise the issue would have risked exposing fractures in the alliance. Churchill and Roosevelt, and later Truman, understood that Stalin's cooperation was indispensable, not only to win the war, but to shape the peace. Thus, silence became policy. The concealment went further than silence. In 1945, as Allied war correspondents documented the liberation of Dachau and Bergen-Belsen, access to Soviet camps was strictly forbidden. Journalists who attempted to investigate were denied visas or expelled. The Soviet narrative was tightly controlled. Their camps were portrayed as necessary measures against fascists and traitors, not instruments of terror. Western governments, wary of confrontation, did little to challenge the narrative. Official communiques spoke vaguely of reparations through labor, while classified memos acknowledged far grimmer realities. In one particularly damning State Department cable, a US diplomat warned that thousands of Polish officers were vanishing into Soviet custody, an ominous foreshadowing of the Katyn revelations. The truth of the Soviet camps began to seep out slowly, through defectors and returning prisoners. In 1946, a handful of German POWs returned home, their gaunt frames testifying to years of starvation. They spoke of endless forests, quarries, and mines where comrades perished by the thousands. In Britain and the United States, such accounts were often dismissed as exaggerations or anti-Soviet propaganda, especially during the fragile years of the Allied occupation of Germany. Even when evidence mounted, including testimonies from neutral observers, official acknowledgement was rare. The silence endured well into the Cold War, when the West, now openly opposed to Moscow, suddenly embraced the stories of survivors as propaganda tools. But by then, countless voices had already been lost. The KGB archives, briefly opened in the 1990s, confirmed what survivors had long claimed. Between 1941 and 1953, more than 5 million prisoners passed through the Soviet POW and Gulag systems. Of these, at least 1 million German prisoners died in captivity, alongside tens of thousands of Hungarians, Romanians, and Poles. Soviet soldiers themselves were not spared. Red Army troops captured by the Germans, and later liberated, were often accused of collaboration and sent to camps upon returning home. Their loyalty questioned, their sacrifice erased, they became prisoners of the very state they had served. In Stalin's Soviet Union, survival on the battlefield was not proof of patriotism. It was grounds for suspicion. The silence of the Allies regarding these camps raises uncomfortable questions. At Nuremberg, the Allies condemned forced labor as a war crime, presenting mountains of evidence against Nazi leaders. Yet in the East, their own ally maintained a parallel system, just as brutal, but beyond accountability. The contradiction was stark, but politically convenient. To confront Stalin would have shattered the unity that defined victory. Thus, the suffering of millions was sacrificed to diplomacy, their voices muted beneath the roar of Allied triumph. The hypocrisy was written into the very architecture of the post-war world. Today, the legacy of these camps is still contested. Russia acknowledges their existence, but frames them as part of wartime necessity, not crimes against humanity. In Germany and Eastern Europe, memorials honor those who vanished into Siberia, never to return. Yet in Western narratives of World War II, the Soviet camps often remain a footnote, overshadowed by the enormity of Nazi atrocities. This imbalance is no accident. It is the product of deliberate decisions taken in wartime conferences and sealed in classified files. The Allies ignored the camps not because they did not know, but because they chose not to act. In the ledger of history, their silence carries as much weight as the crimes themselves. The declassified cables, the surviving testimonies, the bones unearthed in frozen soil, they all tell the same story. The liberation celebrated in 1945 was incomplete. One set of barbed wires was cut, but another remained intact, stretching across thousands of kilometers of Soviet territory. The Allies looked away, and in doing so, became complicit in the suffering they vowed to end. The Soviet prisoner camps, ignored then and often forgotten now, stand as a grim reminder that victory does not erase responsibility, and silence can be as damning as complicity. Chapter 5: Operation Keelhaul's disturbing forced repatriations. In the aftermath of victory in 1945, millions of displaced people crisscrossed the shattered landscape of Europe. Refugees fled westward from advancing Soviet forces, prisoners of war waited in limbo, and entire communities were uprooted by shifting borders. Amid this chaos, one of the most disturbing and long-suppressed Allied operations unfolded under a name as cold as its execution: Operation Keelhaul. Between 1945 and 1947, British and American forces forcibly repatriated at least 2 million Soviet citizens, soldiers, prisoners of war, Cossacks, civilians, even children, into Stalin's hands. For many, the journey home was not a liberation, but a death sentence. The Yalta Agreement, signed by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin in February 1945, laid the foundation. It mandated the return of all Soviet nationals to their homeland, regardless of their wishes. This bureaucratic clause, buried within diplomatic communiqué, became the justification for one of the darkest Allied betrayals of the war's aftermath. The victims of Operation Keelhaul came from every corner of Europe. Among them were Red Army soldiers captured by the Wehrmacht, who had survived years in German prison camps. There were also civilians who had fled advancing Soviet forces, fearing reprisals for imagined disloyalties. Entire communities of Cossacks, some of whom had fought against the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War and later aligned with German units out of desperation, sought refuge in Austria and Italy. When British and American troops encountered them, many believed they would be granted asylum. Instead, they were herded into camps under Allied guard, told they would be processed for resettlement. Few realized that trains and trucks would soon deliver them eastward, into the custody of Soviet NKVD officers waiting at the borders. The deception was deliberate. Allied soldiers, some uneasy with their orders, often concealed the truth from those they guarded. Survivors recall announcements that they were being sent to refugee centers or that their families would be reunited in safe zones. When the transports arrived at Soviet checkpoints, the ruse collapsed. Screams erupted as prisoners realized their fate. Some resisted, clinging to barbed wire or throwing themselves into rivers rather than board trains. Others took their own lives in acts of final defiance. British soldiers stationed at Lienz in Austria reported mass suicides among Cossack families, entire groups drowning themselves in the Drava River rather than face Soviet reprisals. The horror of these scenes haunted even the men ordered to enforce them, many of whom left written testimonies decades later. The Allies knew what awaited those repatriated. Intelligence reports circulated within the War Office, and the State Department made it clear. Stalin viewed returning prisoners not as victims, but as traitors. In his eyes, surrender was equivalent to treason. Soviet soldiers who had been captured, regardless of circumstance, faced interrogation, execution, or exile to the Gulag. Civilians who had lived under German occupation were similarly condemned as collaborators. American and British officials, reading these reports, chose silence. They rationalized their compliance as the price of maintaining the Grand Alliance, of avoiding a rupture with Moscow during delicate post-war negotiations. The cost was measured not in diplomacy, but in human lives. Perhaps the most infamous episode of Operation Keelhaul occurred in May 1945 at Lienz, where British forces rounded up tens of thousands of Cossacks, including women, children, and the elderly. Many had never been Soviet citizens at all, having fled Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution decades earlier. Yet under the broad terms of the Yalta Agreement, they were classified as Soviet nationals and delivered to Stalin's agents. Eyewitness accounts describe columns of Cossacks, some in tears, others chanting prayers, marched under armed guard toward trains. Officers who resisted were beaten unconscious. Families were torn apart in chaotic scenes of despair. Within days, those trains crossed into Soviet-controlled territory. Few were seen again. American forces carried out similar operations in Bavaria and northern Italy. Camps holding displaced Soviet citizens became sites of forced deportations, their inhabitants driven onto trucks under the watch of US military police. In some cases, resistance turned violent. Prisoners fought back with makeshift weapons, only to be subdued by bayonets and rifle butts. The brutality was systematic, recorded in classified after-action reports that remained sealed for decades. Those reports, when finally declassified in the 1970s, revealed not only the scale of the operation, but the chilling bureaucratic language that disguised its human toll. Words like transfer and repatriation masked a reality of coercion, betrayal, and death. The moral dissonance was stark. At the very moment the Allies condemned Nazi leaders at Nuremberg for crimes against humanity, they themselves were delivering millions to certain suffering. Publicly, leaders spoke of liberation, freedom, and human rights. Privately, they authorized actions that consigned countless men, women, and children to gulags, firing squads, or starvation in remote Siberian settlements. Churchill, Roosevelt, and later Truman all sanctioned the operation, viewing it as an unpleasant but necessary concession to Stalin. In the calculus of great powers, the lives of the displaced were expendable. For decades, the story of Operation Keelhaul remained buried. Survivors who escaped or emigrated told their stories, but official acknowledgement was absent. Western governments denied involvement or minimized the scale. It was not until historian Julius Epstein forced the release of US Army documents in the 1970s that the truth began to surface. His research, based on declassified reports and testimonies, revealed the systematic nature of the deportations and the high-level decisions behind them. By then, most of the victims were long dead, their fates sealed by the silence of the very governments they had once trusted for refuge. The legacy of Operation Keelhaul remains deeply unsettling. It challenges the narrative of the Second World War as a straightforward battle of good versus evil. It forces us to confront the compromises made in the name of alliance, the human cost of diplomacy. The men, women, and children forced back across the borders were not statistics but individuals, betrayed by the victors of a war they had hoped would bring them safety. Their cries, silenced by the clatter of train wheels, echo through the declassified files. The disturbing truth is unavoidable. Liberation was not universal, and for millions, victory brought not freedom but a final, devastating betrayal. Operation Keelhaul is a reminder that history's triumphs often conceal darker realities. The photographs of victory parades and the rhetoric of peace overshadow the voices lost in forced repatriations. The declassified files strip away that illusion, exposing the disturbing cost of compromise. Behind every official communique, every diplomatic handshake, lay a silent train bound eastward, carrying souls who would never return. This was the price of alliance, paid in human lives, erased from public memory for decades until the archives, reluctantly, surrendered their truth. History is often remembered in absolutes, victory and defeat, good and evil, liberation and oppression. Yet the stories unearthed from declassified archives tell a more haunting tale, one woven with compromise, betrayal and silence. From the grotesque laboratories of Unit 731 to the shadowy corridors of Operation Paperclip, from Churchill's erased Blacklist to the ignored Soviet camps, and the chilling machinery of Operation Keelhaul, each revelation forces us to ask, how much truth was hidden in the name of stability? These files remind us that history is not only what was recorded, but also what was deliberately erased. Even today, black ink covers names in official documents, and sealed vaults guard secrets too dangerous to reveal. How many other atrocities lie buried in archives, waiting for a future generation willing to confront them? As these disturbing fragments surface, we are left with questions that may never be answered. What is still hidden, and what will it cost to uncover it?